Barrick is moving to become one of the top copper producers in the world. They want that. They're focused on that. That's their goal. Like, they're laser focused on it. And where is that centered? Zambia. Where specifically? Right beside us.
This is Jay Martin.
Adrian, it's good to see you, man. Thank you for coming in today.
Thanks, Jay. Glad to be here.
Okay, lots of different directions that I want to go. Lots of ground I want to cover. I want to start with this sort of high-level copper conversation. And I want to start here because so frequently, Adrian, we hear the first half of the copper conversation, which is we're running out, essentially. We're going to hit a supply cliff. Yeah. We also hear that demand's not going anywhere. And that makes logical sense. Humans will keep building. And we're going to dive into the various demand drivers that are most significant today. Nobody talks about the second half. What happens next? What happens when we hit the supply cliff and demand keeps going? We don't talk about that because it's largely a question mark. We don't know what we're going to do. Totally. I mean, either the lights are going to go out or the price is going to go up or we're going to find some new copper. One of those three things.
Absolutely.
So paint us a picture. Let's start general strokes here. Yeah. Copper outlook. Give me your thoughts and then I'm going to pull on some threads.
For sure. So I think the big things to look for, without getting into ultra specific numbers, you don't really need to. What you have to understand is that the move towards copper, this cliff as you refer to it, is going to be driven by manufacturing. Okay, so two major centers, EVs and AI data centers. And I think the thesis towards EVs has been softening a little. You're hearing that, maybe those numbers aren't as realistic as people thought. Maybe governments pushing countries towards the switch to EVs was a little premature. And maybe the materials we need just aren't there yet. But AI data centers aren't going anywhere. Like, the reality is that is happening. That is going to drive this move towards this cliff and this deficit of copper. And we need new production. We need new deposits discovered. And we need to be moving towards that as quickly as possible. And that's the real challenge right now, is where is that copper going to come from? So that's what you really need to figure out.
Yes.
And the deficit's real, for sure. It's there. It's just a question of how do we solve that issue?
And when it comes to things like EV outlook, I mean, the same thing happens every time we have a new technology. We create a forecast around it. It always starts out super hot. We get really excited and then it doesn't immediately meet expectations. So we calm down and we say, oh, it was a false alarm. Things aren't really going that direction. But it's just because nothing meets sensational expectations and nothing goes up in a straight line. And as I understand the EV demand metrics, it's almost more significant when you look at the charging networks as opposed to just the cars themselves, because the cars obviously take a lot more copper, but it's the networks of infrastructure we're going to have to keep building. I mean, how frequently when you're driving around the country do you see gas stations? That's what we're going to have to rebuild. For sure. It's the charging network.
Yep.
And little things on the margin too. I was chatting with Peter Schiff yesterday. He came on the podcast and he just bought an electric boat. Now it's silly, like, it is what it is, but he loves it. And he's like, electric cars are cool. And he owns a couple, but he's like, the user experience of an electric boat is completely different because boats are recreational. And when you're on the water on an electric boat, there's zero noise pollution. So it actually massively amplifies the experience. Now, look, little events, Peter on his yacht in Puerto Rico, but it's on the margin. Things like this will keep on occurring. And so it's easy to isolate one little thing and say, like, Tesla share price, Tesla output, copper demand, but it's far more nuanced than that.
Absolutely.
Now take your take on copper pricing over the last 6 months. We saw a pretty healthy run up. Things have cooled down a little bit, but how would you interpret copper pricing today?
Well, I think copper pricing softening a little bit was to be expected. There's no shock there.
Just because we got pretty hot in the summer?
100%.
Yeah.
Things were a little bit amplified and that's okay. That's always going to happen. But again, coming back to the exact same thing, that deficit's real. That deficit's coming. And with a lack of new supplies coming on stream, what's going to happen to the copper price? I mean, it's an absolute no-brainer. The copper price is going to keep going. So there is an absolute expectation on our side that copper price is going to continue to go up, and assets are still too far out that there's nothing there that can soften that up.
Right.
So, from my perspective, copper price is going to just keep going.
So I want to get your thoughts on something. Sure. And I've often heard the comparison, copper is the new oil. And it's easy to pick a team on that statement and say, oh, absolutely, because electrification, or, oh, no, not at all. We're not moving away from diesel, and et cetera, et cetera. And the reality is probably somewhere in the middle.
Agreed.
I wondered how much, and I saw this smelter, almost like cartel activity occurring in China over the summer, where, so smelters are the middleman, right, between copper concentrates and refined outputs.
Correct. Yeah.
And their margin is the treatment fees that they charge on like a per ton basis. So they buy the concentrate, they charge usually like 60 to $80 per ton on the concentrate as their treatment fee. But because they're all struggling to find copper concentrate because we're not producing enough, they began undercutting each other and saying, look, I'll produce your copper at $50 per ton or $40.
Yeah, your cartel analogy is kind of right on the money.
It's kind of like OPEC, isn't it? And that makes the copper's the new oil story like a bit more, gives it a bit more legs in reality.
It does, totally. So then you have to wonder, how to get around that, right? So I think then you have to look at projects that actually have their own smelter on site.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
Like that's my theory on it. And where do you see that? You see it in Zambia. You see it in DRC.
Yeah.
So you're seeing whether it's Kamoa-Kakula or whether it's Kansanshi. And Kansanshi is a massive part of our story. But they have probably the most efficient copper smelter on the planet. And it's on site. Right. So they're avoiding that issue. And that, to me, is the answer on that side, is that more of these assets, as they're built, right, they need to be putting their own smelters in place and not having to rely on the Chinese smelters for that.
Yeah, because right now, like over 50% of smelters are in China.
100%.
Right. And they're not very geologically endowed when it comes to copper. So it's coming from somewhere else.
It's coming from somewhere else.
Yeah.
Smelter there, and then going out with these ridiculous fees like you're talking about.
Okay.
As opposed to the smart money would put their own smelter in place. And sure, that's a huge capital cost. But at the end of the day, what are you avoiding? You're avoiding the exact issue you're describing. And that's a smart way to do it.
Yeah.
So either working with an asset like we are, where there's a smelter in place, and by default, we avoid that. And of course, it's not our end of the chain, right? Like once we hand off material, if we get to that phase, we're not worrying about that.
Interesting.
But the reality is, if you have an asset that you're going to build, if you're going to build a mine, why wouldn't you build a smelter as well?
Yeah.
And avoid that issue.
Well, that makes sense. And like to close the loop on that, because what occurred is the smelters got together and said, we need to modulate or moderate our purchasing, right? And if we slow down our purchasing, then we can drive the price back up.
Yes.
And this is the way around that. Because immediately I was like, oh, this is a really interesting thread to follow here. Yeah. Okay. So speaking about geography then, there's no perfect jurisdictions. No matter where you go, there's potential problems. You can be in like a tier 1 jurisdiction, Canada, US, but you may run into decades of permitting issues.
Can happen anywhere.
It can happen anywhere, right? So what do you see globally right now, jurisdictions that are, we're going to get to Zambia because I think Zambia is very interesting, but anything strike you globally right now? Like where's the action in the copper sector? And obviously I'm thinking about
look, I mean, it is going to come across as pure bias, but the reality is the action's in Zambia. Okay. Like that is the answer.
Yeah.
You can look at different jurisdictions. So the US is always going to be a great jurisdiction, especially for copper. Southern US.
Sure.
South America, obviously there's numerous jurisdictions, but look at what's happening in Panama, right? Like let's just look at Cobra Panama. Yeah. You're looking at what First Quantum has been dealing with. That was I think 5% of the world's copper production was coming from Cobra Panama.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That is an absolutely outstanding asset. That's a major asset. That's a globally impactful, important asset, and it's off the table. Where does that put everybody? Well, it puts First Quantum right back in Zambia. It puts them focusing and refocusing at Kansanshi. And when you look at exploration activity, there's a reason why people are in Zambia. There's multiple reasons, which I know we're going to dive into. You just saw the announcement from Ivanhoe, and maybe you didn't see it, but Ivanhoe has now partnered with the Zambian government, and the Zambian government's going to basically feed geological ideas and information and project ideas to Ivanhoe, and Ivanhoe is going to aggressively come into Zambia and start exploring. That speaks volumes. Okay, you seeing like they have Kamoa-Kakula's 1.4 billion tons at 3% copper, or just shy of 3% copper, and the most phenomenal asset out there. It's just north of us in the DRC, but they're moving across the border to Zambia. And why are they doing that? Because it's the top place in the world to be. So when you think about exploration activity, development activity, where do you want to be? That is ground zero. It's the #1 place in the world. And I can give you all kinds of anecdotes.
Yeah, no, I want to pull that apart because it may be off some people's radar. They may think copper, oh no, that's Chile, that's Argentina, maybe DRC, you know, to an extent. So what's happening on the ground in Zambia? Speak to me geologically and from a corporate standpoint. You know, who has the boots on the ground and what's coming out of Zambia right now?
For sure. So you mentioned DRC. Look, DRC is a great jurisdiction in terms of assets. If you look at Kamoa-Kakula, it's an absolute monster, right? 1.4 billion tons at 3%. It's hard to understand how big that actually is. It is absolutely enormous by any stretch.
Yeah.
But I could be mistaken, but Ivanhoe, I think, has 36% of that asset. That's the cost of doing business in the DRC. So if you want to work in the DRC, you're going to deal with the government issues in the DRC. You're going to have backing from other entities that are going to give you political strength. It is a tough, tough jurisdiction to work in. But Zambia, by contrast, isn't. I mean, this is a democratically elected government. This is a country that has a proper mining act in place. And when you look at particularly the Domes region where we are, you look at that region, which is essentially the same spot that Kamoa-Kakula is, it's just straddling the DRC border, right? And you look at what the arrangement is there and the kind of people that are around. You've got First Quantum. You have Barrick. Barrick is moving, and I'm sure lots of people realize this, but I talk to people every day that don't. Barrick is moving to become one of the top copper producers in the world. They want that. They're focused on that. That's their goal. Like, they're laser focused on it. And where is that centered? Zambia. Where specifically? Right beside us. They know that Zambia is the #1 place to be, and that's where they're centering their move to become a major copper producer. And so you've got First Quantum, Barrick, Anglo, Rio Tinto, you know, like you have every major player in the world, and now KoBold through us, and KoBold's working off to the east on another project as well, but everybody is coming to Zambia and everybody's coming to the Domes region because it is simply the best place to be. And it's the best place from, as I mentioned, democratically elected government, proper mining act in place. So if you want an asset to be built, this is a place where you not only can build it, but the government's going to encourage it. You know, they're doing what they need to, and they're taking the right steps to bolster the mining sector, move it forward, and move projects forward. The other thing is when you get into the geological environment, that's really critical because when you're looking at a global perspective towards copper projects, you're typically looking at porphyry deposits, right?
Yeah.
Porphyry deposits are inherently difficult, and all the easy ones have been found. So, you know, and I mean, that's a bold statement. All the easy ones have been found. Maybe not every easy one has been found, but the majority of them have. So now you're looking at projects that are typically deeper. They might be high grade. There's some really impressive new high grade porphyries out there. But what does that cost? What does it cost to build? What does it cost depending on the country it's located in? Is it a difficult jurisdiction? And if you're looking at CapEx, and this is what I talk about a lot, you know, when you look at the CapEx that's required for a junior company, you have to start to think about how realistic it is. And can these projects be built? I would argue that most porphyries cannot be built. Most of the new ones, simply because they are too deep. And even if they're high grade, they're just too expensive.
That's the slippage ratio, essentially how much dirt you have to remove to get to a...
How deep is this thing? How do you attack it? Is it an underground copper mine? Is it a block cave model? You hear a lot of buzz about block cave, right? So let's say all the low-hanging fruit's been picked. And I think the majority of it has. The projects that are porphyry deposits, that are near surface, that are relatively easy, that have a capex that you can deal with, whether it's 1 or 2 billion or whether it's 500 or 800 million. Let's call it anything under 2 billion you could maybe figure out. Those have been found. Those have been developed. So the stuff that you hear now that's in the pipeline could be a 2, 3, 4, $5 billion capex. That to me instantly goes, forget it. For sure. I just don't see it coming together. Then you throw the layer of block cave on top of that. So block cave mining is incredibly capital intensive at the front end. So when you're talking $2 billion capex, now it's a $2 billion capex in year 1. How do you come up with $2 billion in year 1 to move a project forward? The simple answer is you can't. So those projects are a lot of arm waving. You know, I think they're great. I think there's a lot of material there, but how do you actually make it happen? And what's the runway? Is the runway 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 7 years or 10 years? If it's 10 years, it has no impact on the global deficit or this cliff that you were referring to. So if you can't get a project developed quickly enough to have a global impact, then Maybe it's just pipeline for down the road. Maybe it's something that'll be developed one day. But there's a history of that throughout the junior sector. I mean, there's projects that are constantly found, developed, and then they sit on the shelf. And maybe they change hands from company to company 10 times before they actually get to production.
Right.
But they're inherently difficult. So then take that idea and move to Zambia. So now you're in a jurisdiction where the geological setting is completely different. There aren't porphyry deposits, there's stratabound deposits or sedimentary hosted deposits. Those deposits are shallow, they're high grade, they're easy to get to, they're all open pit. Now those are projects that can be developed with a capex that companies can handle and can be developed quickly. And you have a government that's supportive of them being developed quickly. So now the whole chain is working in your favor, and that's why everybody's there. So the reality is it's the right deposits, right setting, right place, and a government that supports it. That's critical.
So key things to recall there is that stratabound in Zambia are generally speaking shallower and higher grade deposits, right?
Correct.
Because to your point, if you have to come up with 2 billion in year one to build, then it's going to be a 5-10 year process. Like what's the actual net present value of that asset? Like you might have to discount that to almost nothing, you know?
Exactly.
That often happens.
Yep.
So, and then we spoke about jurisdictional risk. I have a thesis I shared with you off camera with Zambia, which is that there's no perfect jurisdictions. They don't exist. There's always some risk.
You're totally right.
When you have a place like Zambia, first of all, it's important that you see a track record of, you know, well-regulated mining activity. Zambia has that, right?
Totally.
Projects do move to production. But more importantly, it's not one company. You mentioned Rio, you mentioned Barrick, Anglo, Ivanhoe, First Quantum. So you have almost like a network effect of protection in that if the government were to move on any one of those stakeholders, the other 6 would become very loud right away, right? Because they'd know, like, we're at risk, we need to band together. Back to the sort of cartel mindset, right? Like, we need to work together here to protect our own best interests, even if we're sort of competitive.
Yep.
Right?
That's right. And you have, again, you have a government that's supportive. You have a president, the president that's in place in Zambia, democratically elected government. From that perspective, it's a dream to work there. It's easy.
Yeah.
But you're dealing with a president that is vocally supportive of the mining sector. And let's look at Solwezi, okay? That's the town near where we're working. And in the Domes region, I mean, you mentioned all of the players that are there. I mentioned all the players that are there. They're all in the Domes region. Like, this is ground zero. This is where it's all happening, right? So you have a town like Solwezi. So Solwezi 10 years ago was 1,000 people. It's 75,000 people today.
Holy smokes.
And that growth is 100% mining.
Right.
So you have Kansanshi, you have Lumwana, you have Sentinel, you have all of these deposits, all of these mines that are operating around there. And that 75,000 people are proud mine workers. These are geologists, these are engineers, these are geoscientists of all different disciplines, all centered in one place, all working there because they love the industry, they love the sector, they're involved in it, and they're proud to be there. And then you have a president that's pushing it forward, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, you're dead on. Is the government going to support those companies? Are those companies going to band together? 100%.
Yeah.
There is strength in numbers. Not that you need that in Zambia simply because it's not a problematic jurisdiction.
Yeah.
But the reality is, yes, everybody's going to be working together. And then you're hearing the discussions coming out from the Zambian government about bolstering mining activity. I mean, that is the agenda right now, is to push it up, to elevate their status from, you know, a number 2 copper producer to even higher. They want to move up in the rankings. They want to be bigger. 75% of their export earnings in Zambia are copper. Like, that is how big this industry is there. And they want it to be even bigger.
75% of their net export earnings come from copper. In Zambia. I didn't know that.
That's huge.
Reason right there. Okay, so Midnight Sun, you guys are obviously in Zambia. Yeah. You've partnered with 2 of the companies that we've discussed thus far, KoBold Metals, which is a really unique and interesting story. And it might be worth just spending 30 seconds explaining what KoBold is, and First Quantum, of course. But so walk us through what Midnight Sun is doing in Zambia right now.
So Midnight Sun is in a really unique position in that we are in the Domes region. And there are very few juniors, if any others, that are in the heart of the Domes region. It's a very specific jurisdiction. So you kind of have this traditional Zambia-Congo copper belt. It's really well known. There's dozens of deposits, dozens of mines. And it runs kind of on this northwest-southeast trajectory. And it straddles the DRC and Zambia border. And then you have this thing that runs east to west called the domes. And it's a specific jurisdiction where all of the majors are working, where the biggest mines in Zambia are and the biggest producers in Africa. So you have Kamoa-Kakula, you have China Molybdenum's Tenke deposit, you have First Quantum's Sentinel mine, which is about 120 kilometers west of us. You have Barrick's Lumwana mine. You have First Quantum's Kansanshi mine, which is the #1 copper producer in Africa. Now, what differentiates those deposits from almost anywhere in the world is exactly what we've been talking about. They're shallow, they're open pit. And when I say shallow, to give you some perspective, we're talking that these deposits are probably 100 meters underground.
Okay.
So, I mean, they're shallow. Yeah. And that makes it easy for open pit. But not only are they shallow, they're typically kind of a flat-lying layer, let's call it 10 to 15 meters thick, that runs for kilometer after kilometer. They just keep going and going and going. It makes it very easy to map out a mine plan and map out engineering because you're simply following the deposit and you're mining it at a similar level all the way across. It makes for a perfect open pit situation.
Yes.
So we're right in the middle of it. We're right smack in the middle of it. And what differentiates all of those deposits is they're 1 billion tons. So when you're talking about big deposits, is a big deposit 200 million tons, 400, 600, 800? Anything over a few 100 million tons is big, but 1 billion tons is absolutely world-class. And you have this concentrated number of absolutely world-class tier 1 deposits and tier 1 operators all clustered in a very small area that's less than 150 kilometers wide. So I always like to say, if you throw a 100-kilometer net over our property, you're going to capture Ivanhoe's Kamoa-Kakula, Tenke's, China Molybdenum's Tenke deposit, First Quantum's Kansanshi mine, Barrick's Lumwana mine, and First Quantum's Sentinel mine. Those are the 5 biggest. And they're literally absolutely surrounding us. We're right in the middle. And so we're only 6 kilometers away from Kansanshi. Less than 10 anyways, very, very close to their mine. Really, the only thing that separates us is the town of Solwezi that I was referring to.
Yeah.
And then Barrick's Lumwana mine is right beside us on the west. And of course, we have tie-ins to Barrick within our organization, which we can talk about a little bit. Some of our new people that we've brought on board that are really, really interesting, very critical to the story, like Kevin Bonnell, who's our new COO. But going back to your question, the Domes region is unique because it has the biggest deposits and the best geology, and everybody's there for that reason. And then put on top of that, the layer we just discussed, which is the government backing those projects to move them forward. It's the perfect storm for big discoveries, and it's one of the only places, if not the only place on the planet today, that has globally impactful deposits that can be put into production and projects that will actually make a difference in that cliff that we were referring to. Yeah.
Now, I mean, you mentioned everybody's there for that reason, but who's conspicuously not there are juniors, except for you. And so the question needs to be asked, Adrian, how did you guys end up in the center of the Domes region with such a 500 square kilometer?
Huge land package.
Huge land package. Yeah. It's massive. Yeah. What's the history there? How did you secure this?
So the history is pretty interesting, actually. If you look back, let's say 20 years, okay, you had Freeport-McMoRan. Freeport-McMoRan was very, very busy in sub-Saharan Africa. They had a big presence in the country. They were working really hard, moving assets forward. And these assets always change hands, right? They move a few times before they end up with the final group that puts them into production. You had First Quantum, of course, 20 years ago. First Quantum was working hard. And First Quantum was a major landholder in the Domes region. So they had, if I'm not mistaken, it's like 15 to 20 licenses or something. And that included Kansanshi. So Kansanshi, again, going back, it's 1 billion tons at 0.66% copper. It's high grade, it's shallow, it's easy. The geology of it's really cool. It's basically shale-hosted copper that's maybe 0.3 to 0.5%. And then they have these giant calcite veins that are, let's say, 3 to 10 meters wide that run 3 to 5%. And that drives the economics of Kansanshi. So it is an incredible deposit. And then we can dive into the oxide thing because that's a big part of our story as well. But basically, First Quantum is there with Kansanshi, and then they have a whole bunch of exploration ground, maybe another 10 or 15 licenses. And the Zambian government, 20 years ago, says, look, we've instituted this use it or lose it rule. We like to call it the use it or lose it rule. The simple thesis behind it is this. If companies are tying up ground in a particular jurisdiction and they're not actively working on it, that does not benefit the jurisdiction as a whole. They need to have companies that are out there, that are aggressive, that are working, that are developing these deposits.
Spending cash.
And developing projects. It's spending cash. Obviously from a revenue perspective, a taxation perspective, that makes sense. But at the same time, it's also not benefiting these assets to be, essentially to be a real estate play and have companies sitting on them.
Totally.
So Zambian government has this use it or lose it rule, and they say, look, if you're not actively exploring, when you do your renewal, we want you to shed property. So the deal is when you do a renewal, you have to drop, I think it's 50%. So you drop a certain percentage and, you start with a huge project and you whittle it down to the part that really matters. And as long as you're moving it ahead, as you meet each step, you can license those and renew them in different ways.
Yeah.
For example, an exploration license is 9 years, a mining license is 25 years.
Okay.
So you can make that transition as you actually reach production. But First Quantum is sitting on a lot of ground. And Zambian government says, look, you have a lot of licenses, you need to drop some of these. So they dropped some ground, and the ground they dropped is the ground that Midnight Sun now owns. And it's not that it wasn't good ground, it was great ground. They did a lot of work there. In fact, a lot of the drill results that we talk about are actually First Quantum drill holes from the time that they owned the property. So that property was then shed. It was picked up by an individual. That individual held it for a number of years, actually did some work, managed to raise some money and do a little bit of exploration work. And we were able to option it from that individual 12 years ago. So
Okay.
almost 12 years ago. So we've had this project for a very, very long time. We've done a ton of work. So, it's really important that people don't think we've been sitting on our hands for 12 years. We have not been sitting on our hands. We've done a tremendous amount of work. But imagine the last 12 years, what did the copper price look like? What did the landscape in the junior world look like? What did the markets look like? Not only have we held on to this project, we've actually moved it forward through the toughest markets on both the copper side and the junior side, general markets.
Yeah.
And so, we've managed to take this and step it forward and do a lot of exploration and make discoveries across the entire project, but we've held on to it for all that time and now finally hit a point where we were able to do the deals that we needed to fund the exploration work and create all kinds of upside, which we've got. But, to answer your question in a very broad way, that's how we ended up with it. We optioned it and we've earned into 100% of the majority of the project. The top portion of it, we have 85% and earning into the balance of that 100% now. And basically over time, we've gotten there. It's pretty incredible.
Yes. All right. Right place, approaching the right time,
Yeah,
right? 12
totally.
years of patience.
Yeah, 12 years of patience.
Good for you, man. I mean, that's what moves the needle, right? It's those companies that are positioned a decade ahead, years ahead.
Totally. It's
Obviously,
always, timing's everything.
timing's,
Right?
yeah, timing's everything,
Always.
right? And patience. Okay, so walk me through the agreements. Let's start with KoBold,
Yes.
Adrian. So what is your agreement with, first of all, maybe if someone's not familiar with who KoBold is, this is an interesting story because this
Super
was like
interesting.
the first major headline of Silicon Valley entering the mining space.
Correct. Yeah.
And the financial backers of KoBold are some of the biggest names in tech, and they've understood they can't proceed any further down their promises of development and further innovation if they don't have access to the ingredients, which is cobalt, copper, et cetera, et cetera. So walk me through the agreement with KoBold Metals.
Okay, so KoBold, to understand, they are an AI mining company. Okay, so they are, at this point, really an explorer. They're not really a mining company yet. They have, I think, 60 companies, or 60 projects, worldwide.
Okay. That they have invested in.
That they've invested in, that they're working on, that they're putting their team on. And I think that's getting whittled down as they go. But the bottom line is, this is a new group. This is a relatively new company. They're private, but they are probably the most geoscientifically rich group I've ever seen in my life. They have 200 geoscientists on staff, mostly from the petroleum sector, but they have geoscientists from just about every discipline.
Yeah.
And they have gone out and created a unique approach. And it is a combination of tremendous geoscience, but at the same time, using really cutting edge technology. So they're using AI and novel technology and basically combining the ultimate geoscientific approach and this ultra technological approach, putting them together and looking at projects with a much more modern, reliant on as much data as possible, but a more modern approach. And the idea is that they think they can move projects forward at a much faster pace than we have traditionally in our industry. And of course, as you know, like our industry is renowned for being a little slow to adopt new things. And so these guys are taking a really different approach. And through that, they've managed to attract some of the biggest Silicon investors in the world, Silicon Valley investors. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund. And really that's how a lot of these people came in. It's his fund that came into KoBold. And you get Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, Jack Ma. I mean, these are the names that are associated with this. It's incredible. But more important to focus on, Bill Gates and the Breakthrough Energy Ventures Fund. They've got Anderson Horowitz. They've got the Canadian Pension Plan. They have the who's who of Silicon Valley investors, and they've managed to attract them because of this kind of modern and more technological approach they're taking.
Yeah.
And then when you look at their geological approach, again, 200 geoscientists. I think they have 65 geoscientists focused just on kind of the copper sector and what they're doing there. So you have kind of this like ultimate group of people, ultimate brain trust going forward, and they are aggressively and actively seeking projects in different jurisdictions that have the potential to, mainly on critical metals, that have the potential to make a difference. And they've centered in Zambia. So, and we're sort of their grassroots exploration play, if you will.
Right.
You know, and I think it would be unfair to call this grassroots at this point. It's much more advanced than that as far as exploration targets. And of course, our target that they're working on is a tier 1 asset as far as exploration targets. But that's who KoBold is in a nutshell. And we couldn't be happier to have them on board. I mean, they're the right group of people, and their chief copper geologist. I think it's important to talk about the team. They've built a phenomenal team, but their chief copper geologist, which is really, I think, how KoBold came to the table for us, is David Broughton. Dr. David Broughton, and he is a phenomenal sedimentary hosted copper geologist. Of course, spent the last 10 or 14 years, 10 or 12 years with Ivanhoe, and led them to the discovery of Kamoa-Kakula.
And he's familiar with your project, quite familiar.
Very familiar with our project. Yeah, in fact, I love to tell this story, and I've told this story a couple of times recently. And of course, myself and Daniel Enderton delivered a keynote at the Washington Precious Metals Conference, the ETMS conference. And basically what the story was that we were talking with David Broughton almost 8 years ago. We had lunch with him, we were talking about projects and we were talking about Zambia. And David said to us at that lunch, he said, look, you know, you guys are obviously a very sincere group of individuals. You're trying to move this project forward. I have to be honest with you, I don't know how you got it.
So this is 8 years ago. So David was with Ivanhoe?
He's with Ivanhoe.
And you had your land package.
We're working on our land package.
This is before KoBold, before
any of it.
Yeah, 8 years ago. Okay.
David says to us, look, you know, I frankly don't know how you did this. Like, I don't know how you got this project. But whatever you need to do, like sell your house, do what you need to do not lose this project. This is a tier 1 exploration target, super important, very valuable ground. Hang on to it, do everything you can not to lose it.
Okay.
And coming from somebody like David Broughton, obviously we listen.
Well, it's nice that he was sincere, because fast forward to him being picked up by KoBold Metals and that group of Silicon Valley money, he moves in on you guys very quickly, right? And you guys come to a deal. So he meant what he said.
He meant what he said, and he stuck to it. And David was around us all that time. So, you know, he's always encouraging. He knows the belt. He knows Zambia. He knows it really well. And it comes back around by KoBold coming into the picture through David. And so,
and what's the agreement with KoBold? Because they have no intention of becoming a mining company. They're not like a major investing in exploration. They're different, right?
They are. So they're what we would refer to as a passive miner. And that's their goal, is to be a passive miner. So the deal we have with them is $15.5 million. It's an earn-in agreement. So $15.5 million, $500,000 is in cash. And that's really just taking care of our Zambian G&A. So at the end of the day, that takes care of our overheads, $100,000 a year for 4.5 years.
Sure.
The real crux of it is the $15 million they're going to spend in the ground.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that it is. And you have to understand that that $15 million is not GA. This is not administrative cost. This is $15 million going in the ground, covering drilling, covering work, covering geochem, whatever we have to do. It's real exploration dollars. And it's not an arbitrary number. So, you know, I think a lot of times when people look at these agreements, they think, well, how did you arrive at 15 million, or how did you arrive at 10 million or 20 or whatever it may be? That $15 million is not arbitrary. That gets us 40 to 50,000 meters of drilling. And if you look across the Domes region at the different deposits that have been discovered, that's the magic number. It's 40 to 50,000 meters to get them to critical mass.
Interesting.
And so we figured that was a great starting point, and KoBold agreed. So we've got a deal in place. So, you know, basically they're going to spend $15 million over 4.5 years. They might reach that quicker. They certainly can. But they're going to get out there. They're going to be aggressive. They built the ultimate team led by David Broughton. And David has cherry-picked the best geologists, the people he thinks are the ultimate people to work on this, put a team together, and they're attacking Dumbwa. And so Dumbwa, and we haven't even covered that. So Dumbwa is the name of the target. And it's incredible. I mean, we're talking a 20-kilometer long soil anomaly. That's 0.73% copper in soil. That's, to put that in perspective, the average grade of Sentinel, Lumwana, and Kansanshi is about 0.58 to 0.59% copper. We're getting 0.73% copper in soil at surface. That's more than compelling. Above and beyond that, if you look at the entire anomaly, there's a vegetation kill zone, which is what I usually refer to it as, but it's soil toxicity. That's caused by a sediment-hosted system at depth. So when you have a 20-kilometer long vegetation kill zone overlaying a 20-kilometer
Meaning for
long...
some reason, over this 20-kilometer stretch, the trees aren't growing.
The trees aren't growing.
Plants aren't growing. Yeah,
the trees aren't growing. There has to be a reason, right? Yeah. So that's soil toxicity. So that's caused typically by a sediment system at depth. So you have giant soil anomaly, super high grade, vegetation kill zone on top of it. That's a pretty compelling story alone, right? Yep. Then in the middle of that, we have probably 10 drill holes that are economic intercepts in terms of grade. These are big intercepts, and we have some that are, 13 meters of 0.77 from surface with no strip, directly into bedrock.
Okay.
These are ore grade intercepts. These are really impressive. And certainly we're not there yet. We need to prove this thing out. But when you're hitting those kind of numbers, those kind of impressive grades over significant widths, and again, going back, these deposits are typically 10 to 15 meters thick. So when you're seeing the right widths, the right kind of grade, that's super compelling. So you've got all of that going for you. Then we have a surface sample taken by Barrick, actually Kevin that works with us now.
Okay.
1.3% copper in bedrock at surface, right in the middle of that geochem anomaly. And then the piece that locked it is our target, or our surface geochem anomaly, extends just beyond our southern boundary. That property across our southern boundary is owned by another major. And they drilled that property about 1.5 years ago, and they hit a very big intercept. And that intercept lit everybody up because people realized this anomaly is real and there's something going on there. So, now through KoBold, we're going to find out. We're going to go in and work on that. So there's all these reasons why it attracted people and why David Broughton highlighted this project and knew that it was a really strong target and came to us 8 years ago and talked about it. But now we're there, and now we have that team.
Yes.
And that's incredible. So now we're going to find out.
So Dembois, the sort of one of 3 targets that you're going to focus on.
Actually. Well, we're going to focus on 3 for now, but yeah, there's 4 targets on the property.
Yes. Okay. So one of the initial 3, funded through 40 to 50,000 meters of drilling in partnership with KoBold. So that program is taken care of. Last question on Dembois, and then I want to move on to one of the other targets. Timeline, Adrian. When can we expect drill results? Everybody wants to know, right? Like, when are we going to get some answers?
The magic question, right? Yeah. So the program's being run by KoBold. Okay. So KoBold's making the decisions, KoBold's making the call, and KoBold has been working diligently on getting a program lined up, getting people in place, and figuring out how to attack this. And the approach has changed slightly from our initial thinking of how it was going to work. They've brought in some different ideas, and partly because Kevin Bonnell has joined. Kevin is our COO now, and he has joined the team. And so he's working with KoBold, and he's of course working with them, giving them some ideas. And Kevin is an unbelievable geologist. He worked with David Broughton with Freeport-McMoRan beyond, like, looking back 20 years ago when they were active in sub-Saharan Africa. They worked together.
Okay.
Very familiar with one another. Kevin is another PhD geo, but he spent the last number of years with Barrick. And if we can digress into that a little bit, I'll give you some color on Kevin Bonnell, because it's really interesting.
Okay.
So Kevin came to us a couple of years ago, really through Barrick. Barrick has been, of course, active on the Lumwana deposit. And if you look back, Barrick purchased Lumwana for like $7 or $8 billion. Very, very high price tag. And the asset wasn't working. It was a tier 2 asset. So, it was a big deposit. It was a well-known deposit, but it wasn't working, and they paid a very, very significant amount for that. So Barrick had to figure out how to make it work. And about 4 years ago, they parachuted Kevin Bonnell in. Kevin was a geologist, as I mentioned. He worked for Freeport. He worked with David back in the day, but he's an absolute expert in these stratabound deposits, just like David. So Barrick brought him in, and in 24 months, turned it into a tier 1 asset. Absolutely phenomenal. As we spent time with Barrick and had teams looking at our property over the years, the gentleman that was involved was Kevin Bonnell. And Kevin ended up joining us about 3 months ago. And so he's joined on as our COO. He knows Dembois well. He's super confident in the target and believes, just like David Broughton, that this thing has massive potential. Okay. So Kevin's on board. He's our geological seat at the table, and he's going to drive the other part of our project, which is the first quantum piece. And I'm sure that's probably what you want to
Let's go there next. Yeah, so walk me through the first quantum deal.
Okay, so the first quantum deal is unique. I think, and I cover this in a lot of different interviews and things because you have to understand why this project is important to understand why we even have the First Quantum deal to begin with. So looking at First Quantum, looking at Cobre Panama, what happened there? They lost 5% of the world's copper production coming from this one asset. They lost that asset.
Yeah.
At least currently. I mean, maybe haven't lost it yet, but it's
offline for now.
It's offline.
Yeah. No cash coming.
So Cobre Panama is off the table. First Quantum has Kansanshi. Kansanshi is a 1 billion ton deposit at 0.66, globally important asset, and happens to be right beside us.
Yeah.
Less than 10 kilometers away from our property.
Yes.
So if you look at First Quantum's Kansanshi mine, they have, to understand simply the mining side of it, they have one of the most efficient copper smelters on the planet, tying back to our discussion about having your smelter on site.
Mm-hmm. They
have 3 different circuits. They have a sulfide circuit, they have a mixed ore circuit, and they have an oxide circuit known as an SXEW. So that oxide circuit is critical to the economics of their operation and how it all works. And if you look at their smelter, they produce a byproduct of about 1 million to 1.3 million tons of sulfuric acid a year.
Okay.
That's critical. Sulfuric acid is a big environmental liability.
Right.
So you're in a landlocked country, you're producing 1.3 million tons of sulfuric acid a year, you have to get rid of it. And how are you going to do that? Are you going to truck it out? You can't. Are you going to ship it out?
It's just too much material.
It's too much material.
Right.
You're also in a landlocked country that has other countries bordering you on all sides. Mm-hmm. Are they going to let you transport 1.3 million tons of sulfuric acid across their country?
Right.
Probably not.
Right.
So you have to figure out a way to get rid of it in situ. Yeah, and First Quantum was brilliant. They figured out exactly how to do it. Oxide copper, which is at surface. This is material that is typically in the first 50 meters of stratigraphy. That oxide copper is rich in malachite. Malachite neutralizes acid. So they heat bleach the oxide copper.
You have the antidote.
And there you go. That's the antidote. Exactly. Right. So your antidote is oxide copper. And they neutralize their acid using oxide copper. And they've been doing that for 20 years. But not only does it neutralize the acid, it liberates the copper that's in the oxides. And all of a sudden you have a concentrated source of copper that you can sell as a byproduct. So that has, bottom line for that, if you look at financials, that's been 200 to 400 million per year of revenue for First Quantum's Kansanshi mine.
Okay.
So key piece of the revenue. Now, how do we play into that?
And that byproduct concentrate can go through the same smelter?
Everything is done through second circuit. So, like they're doing, it's all separate, and that's why it's all separate.
Yeah.
Whether or not that last step is a smelter, I don't know exactly how they deal with it on site, other than I know it's concentrated. I know it's sold at that.
Okay.
So if you take their current situation, now they are refocused at Kansanshi, right? Super important. They need that to work.
Yes.
Unfortunately, they've depleted their oxide resources.
Okay.
So now all of a sudden, Cobre Panama's out the door. They're stockpiling acid, and they've just lost this big revenue stream. They're stockpiling
sulfuric acid. They've run out of the oxide, the antidotes.
They've still got sulfides. They just opened up a brand new sulfide lens. They have a robust resource there, lots of sulfides. But now that's running through the smelter, and they're producing sulfuric acid, and they're stockpiling it, and they have to get rid of it.
Yeah.
But they're out of oxides.
They're out of oxides.
So where are they going to get oxides from? Can they use limestone? That is another thing that they can use. There is no source big enough in Southern Africa or in the southern half of Africa that could possibly supply enough limestone to deal with this. So oxides are the answer. Where are their oxides? Where can they get oxides from? Well, Midnight Sun is sitting on a property that has oxides in numerous locations. First Quantum's aware of that. They've been, they worked on this property back in the day. So we have a nice continued dialogue about oxides. And we decide, upon completion of the deal with KoBold and knowing that we're moving forward on Dumbwa, that we're going to refocus and we're going to see just what we have in terms of oxides. We've intercepted them drilling in numerous locations, Kaziba and Mitu being the top 2 areas.
Yeah.
So we know there's a concentration there. We know that we have an area that we can work on this and some big targets to develop a feed source for Kansanshi. And so when we're financing last spring, we continue our discussion with First Quantum, and we decide that we are going to enter a cooperative exploration plan, which is basically they're going to put forth assistance to us, geological expertise, engineering expertise.
Yes.
And they're going to take care of some of the odds and ends that we need to move this forward quickly to expedite the process.
Right.
And we are developing oxide resources on our property that can feed Kansanshi. And we have two targets in particular that we think we can do that are really outstanding.
KoBold and Me Too?
KoBold and Me Too.
KoBold and Me Too. So First Quantum is incentivized to assist your exploration on KoBold and Me Too because they appear to be oxide-rich, which is what they need for their sulfuric acid output coming out of their smelter, because they're presently running out of oxides themselves.
So we think we can solve their issue, and they think we can solve their issue.
So that, in a sense, could fast track Midnight Sun to some level of production, because you're producing an oxide, you've got a buyer next door with a smelter on site who needs what you have, and they're going to assist in the exploration and development of that. Okay.
Exactly. Okay. So the goal is, let's get out there, let's drill. So we've laid out a plan, which we've now kicked in, of course.
Yeah.
We're going to start at KoBold. We're going to do somewhere in the range of 3,000 meters of drilling, but the plan is unbelievably simplistic. So when you look at the timelines to production, okay, going back to the initial part of our discussion here about what projects can you move forward quickly? What can you get into production? What can have a global impact? We're looking at areas where we can have oxides going to Kansanshi, and we think we can get there in 12 months. Find me a project. Find me a project globally that's talking about production in something like 12 months. I mean, that is beyond intrinsically rare. Like, that is an absolute anomaly. But because of the location, the proximity, I mean, it comes down to the proximity to Kansanshi. We can solve an issue. We're in the right place, and we have the right material on our property. So the area at KoBold that we're going to be looking, historically, we have about 31 drill holes into it. So we have a target there that's 300 meters wide. Lots of big intercepts, 20 meters of 3.3%, 12 meters of 1.6. These are high grade. You know, when you look at Kansanshi is typically running in their SXEW circuit, it's more like 0.3. So this is very high grade by comparison. And we think we can string together something at Kansanshi that will be impactful for Kansanshi, that will get them at least a couple of years of production.
Of oxide supply.
Of oxide supply.
Right.
The key being, they have a haul road. Their haul road runs right beside our property. And again, we're only 6 kilometers
away. So the
away.
transportation infrastructure exists.
It's all there.
That's what that means.
It's all there. And this is material. This is a mobilized oxide blanket. So when you think of that, imagine you're looking at this property and you have an area 300 meters wide, and you have material at surface that's, let's call it on average, if we look at those 31 drill holes, the average grade's about 1.3%. So if you have an area that, let's call it, you know, a few million tons, maybe up to 15, we'll see what it ends up being when we get out there and drill. But a mobilized oxide blanket, meaning it's detached from the original sediment source. So imagine a big deposit. You've got this top section that gets oxidized, and some event geologically moves it. So it's detached from that original deposit, but it's moved maybe 100 meters away or 200 meters away or whatever it may be. So it's isolated. We know it's isolated. We know it's a mobilized blanket, but that means you have material sitting at surface with zero strip that is literally ready to be excavator mined. That means literally bring an excavator in, scoop the material off the surface, put it in a dump truck, and take it to Kansanshi. It's that simplistic. But what we need to do is we need to go in there. We need to systematically drill that off. We need to go in there with a strategy that will satisfy what First Quantum needs. Make sure that when they come in to do engineering and mine planning and pit planning and everything else that will be required once we prove up a deposit of size, that they can do that really, really quickly. And they think they can accomplish that within kind of a 12-month window. So our original plan was to go in there. We were thinking it might take 4 to 5 months to drill it off. Now we're looking at a very short window. That's a matter of a couple of months. We're looking at a cost of around, let's call it $500,000, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. And a plan that includes some different tactics, really. And this is being led by Kevin Bonnell. I mean, Kevin is a brilliant geologist, and this is right up his alley. So when you look at the plan now, it's much shorter, it's quicker, and they're going to employ RC and air core drilling. So they're going to drill some holes there, probably somewhere in the range of 3,000 meters, give or take. They're going to do IP on some of the targets, a couple of different targets on the property. So they're going to do some IP, and then they're going to do ionic leach sampling. So that's a type of geochem that's very accurate, that'll allow them to build out critical mass to this thing with the quickest amount of time as possible, you know, so very, very quickly get to the heart of the matter, get the information that First Quantum needs, and let First Quantum expedite the whole process. So that's the goal at KoBold. It's powerful, it's quick, it can be impactful, and it can solve First Quantum's issue, which is important to them. They're the largest taxpayer in Zambia. It's important to the Zambian government.
First Quantum's the largest taxpayer in Zambia.
They are.
Right.
So this is super important from all fronts, and we're a solution to that issue.
That's interesting. That's a good ally to have in the country.
It's a good ally to have. So then you look at Me Too. Me Too is a secondary target that we have, a much larger footprint, and we think we can solve the issue for an even longer amount of time there, and really put First Quantum in a great position to keep moving, have the oxides they need to take care of their acid issue at site.
So that's why I know in your news flow there was almost an issue with your KoBold.
Yes, KoBold license.
KoBold license, and it seemed to resolve inexplicably and quickly.
Yes.
And I could speculate that the largest taxpayer in Zambia, who's partnered on that project, probably had something to do with resolving that quickly for you.
I think we have lots of speculation, and we're hearing a lot of speculation in the market about what happened. At the end of the day, we resolved the issue remarkably quickly. I mean, it was resolved in less than 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, you protect your biggest client if you're Zambia.
Certainly.
Right?
It does not hurt that we're working with First Quantum, and that's a key piece of this entire cooperative exploration plan that we have with them. But, we had an issue there. There was a license issue, and it's been rectified. So for us, all systems go. We're back on track. KoBold is all sorted out. We're ready to rock. We're on our way.
That's right.
So drilling, we've got, as I mentioned, somewhere in the range of 3,000 meters and IP and all these things. And we're going to find out just how big this target is at KoBold and get that moving towards production. So we have the chance to be not just exploring on a giant SEDEX target down at Dumbwa or a big stratabound target. We have a near-term production scenario that's unfolding. And that is a remarkable, I like to say it's kind of the unicorn in our business to have production and to have big exploration upside. And we have 4 targets. Like we have 3 stratabound targets outside of Dumbwa, but Dumbwa is tier 1. It's the top one. It's the quickest to move on it. 2 areas we're going to work on oxides with First Quantum and an aggressive plan with KoBold.
So I know for exploration companies in general, you have to be agile with your vision.
Yes.
Because you're in the business of answering unanswered questions. Totally. You get the answers, you pivot, you're agile, you got to be. You're in a unique place, however, where you're potentially near-term production on your KoBold project with a partner. And really interesting, Adrian, how you've, I don't want to say outsourced, but the movement and the development inside the company is somewhat outsourced, right? Like First Quantum is taking charge on KoBold, KoBold is taking charge on Dumbwa, and through these strategic partnerships that provide capital and resources and expertise and infrastructure, in the case of First Quantum, you're moving these things forward. Is it too early for you to say, like, this is the grand vision for Midnight Sun?
No, that is the grand vision for Midnight Sun. Absolutely.
Well, okay, so expand on that for me then. Yeah.
So when you look at this project, we talked about how the company's had this project for 12 years. We sat down as a group and we looked at how do we move these assets forward? This is winding back the clock, let's say 24 months.
Sure.
How do we move these assets forward into a rising copper market? We know that timing is in our favor. We could feel the wind in our sails, right? We knew that the time was coming. And we had to pivot and make some decisions on how do we attack this? Do we go out and raise the requisite amount of money to attack these targets on our own? And do we have the geological expertise to do that? One thing to understand is that these sediment-hosted targets are very complicated. Okay, we have discoveries across our entire property. Our property is 506 square kilometers. So imagine how big that is. So 506 square kilometers, 4 separate targets. Everywhere we go, we get big intercepts. We drill impressive intercepts. We find mineralization that tells you that there's something big going on, but we need to get them to hang together. And in order to do that, you need deep geological understanding, and you need a systematic approach that is fairly capital intensive. Not terrible, but at the end of the day, it still costs a lot of money to move these forward.
Yeah,
and you 100%. Have to be focused. So we looked at that and said, can we string together a plan? Can we pick a target to attack? We know Dumbwa's great. We know Dumbwa's a solid target. We know KoBold is a solid target. We know we have oxides. We know we have Me Too. So we have 3 or 4 areas that we know we can go and work. We know we have discoveries, but how do we move it forward? And we made a decision as a group that the best way to do it was to bring in a partner. To bring in a partner that has the geological expertise, that has the capital to move it forward, and to employ an approach where we work with them, we let them earn in, we let them have a majority interest in one of the targets, but we save the other 3 for ourselves. So if you have 4 targets and you have one that you have somebody earn in on, and we're talking again about billion-ton deposits. So if we're successful at Dumbwa and we have a billion-ton deposit at, let's call it 0.5, just to go with the average in the area.
Sure.
Billion-ton deposit at 0.5% copper, what's that worth? 6 billion, 8 billion, 10 billion, 12 billion, massive assets. So if we have 25% of that, is it small? 25% of billion-ton copper deposit at 0.5 is a massive asset. That should cause a big re-rate for Midnight Sun. So when we look at it, we said, look, let's move that asset forward. Let's attack that. Let's get it developed, and let's show the market that we can do it. And then we have 3 other targets that we can go and work on. We're going to leave those. We're going to put those on the shelf and keep those as blue sky. And so that was the grand vision, was let's bring a group in. And we had lots of interest from other groups. We had multiple offers, and if you go back 18 months.
Yeah.
But KoBold was the group we chose. And we chose that group because they were the only one that believed in our vision in doing a deal on just one target and not all 4.
Interesting.
And if we brought in one of the other groups and we did a deal on all 4 targets, and we had to sit there for a year or 2 without work or be beholden to their news flow or anything else, that could have been the worst thing we could have done.
Right.
That could have been very problematic for us. But we had a vision of just one piece. So we did a deal with KoBold. We brought them in to develop Dumbwa. The goal then being to leave those 3 other targets as blue sky for our shareholders, for our investors, that one day we can go and do on our own, or bring in other groups or figure those out as we go.
Well, yeah, okay.
You know, and then looking at the oxides as potential cash flow.
Yes.
And our theory was, let's see if we can push those oxides to the point that we can find a buyer for them. So we plan to go out on our own and drill those off. And keeping in mind, these are shallow. These are 50 to 60 meters deep. So drilling there is going to be shallow, which means it's going to be inexpensive. We have the geological understanding. This is simplistic stuff. So we figured, let's go out, let's let Dumbwa move forward with whatever partner we bring in. And that, of course, ended up being KoBold. Now we can go and focus on oxides. We can prove up critical mass there. We can show that we have a valuable asset that can be, useful for anybody in the region that has a smelter that needs this oxide material.
Because this is a common problem. This is not a first quantum problem.
For sure.
Yeah.
And there's no local market, you have to understand, for sulfuric acid. There's no local market.
Not when you're in Zambia.
Not in Zambia.
I mean, not ever, but discarding it is tougher when you're landlocked.
Exactly. And you can't ship it around. So you have to deal with it in situ. So we knew that that was valuable for a number of entities. If we could go out and prove up that oxide resource, that it had intrinsic value, we're smart to go and do that. So that was the grand vision, was move Dumbwa forward, use that to leverage the other 3 assets forward, go and develop the oxides, try and move that towards cash flow. And now we've got this cooperative exploration plan with First Quantum, where we have, very near-term production on the horizon if we're successful. And that will in turn result in significant cash flow for Midnight Sun that could put us in a position to...
Can you put some visibility on significant cash flow?
That's pretty tough to do, realistically, but I think you can look to First Quantum's numbers. I would say that the easiest way to look at what that could be is to look at First Quantum's numbers. Look at what they're doing. They do 25,000 tons per day through that mill. And if we can satisfy that SXEW circuit at 25,000 tons per day, that's very significant cash flow for Midnight Sun, and would move us from, a junior explorer to a production level company with significant cash flow that can fund the development of those other 3 targets. So then you look at, again, going back to our grand vision, a re-rate on Dumbwa.
Yeah.
So if you have a billion-ton deposit, if we're lucky enough that it is what everyone seems to think it is, and it's a domes region deposit, and it's in that critical mass category as similar to those others, what's the re-rate on Dumbwa? And then on top of that, if you have significant near-term production at Kaziba and Me Too, what's the re-rate there? And the combination of the 2 could be absolutely impressive, from so many different angles. But that could
re-rates the value of Midnight Sun, allows you to go back to the market with more options when you look at developing the other targets.
Well, totally. And I mean, I have to ask, do you even go back to the market? Because if you have that kind of cash flow, do you need to go back to the market at all? Probably not.
Interesting. Okay.
So, and then we backed that up by financing. So we raised $10 million in May.
That's right.
I mean,
in the spring.
There's your stamp of approval, right? We launched a financing at $3 million in March. By April, it was already 5. By the end of April, it was 7, then it was 9, then it was 10. And I remember standing in Washington, D.C., again, at the Precious Metals Conference where we were speaking and doing the math on where the financing was at. And the demand was absolutely overwhelming. We were approaching 10 million and we capped it at 10. That was it. That was enough for us. That gave us enough capital to move forward. We have some warrants that we expect to come down for another influx of cash. So Midnight Sun is in a remarkable position. We have significant cash in the bank. We have a big project being moved forward to build critical mass and a near-term production scenario. And that's why, 20 minutes ago in our discussion here, I referred to it as a unicorn. I don't know any other company that's doing that. And that was our grand vision.
Location on the global map too, there's a lot of threads to pull on with this. It's a really interesting story, and not just from the micro developments, I don't call them micro, but the micro developments inside of Midnight Sun up to the macro distribution of copper and the significance of Zambia. Lots going on and lots of news flow to come with your fully funded program in Dumbwa, with things moving forward with First Quantum. So investors should look out for news.
We're not wasting time. We're going after Me Too as well.
Okay.
And so that's going to be a bigger, longer drill program, bigger target, more drill holes, different approach. It's tied to a sediment target. So unlike Kaziba, that's a mobilized blanket, Me Too is a little bit more complicated, but the numbers down there are super impressive.
And forgive me, is that also in partnership with First Quantum?
It is.
It is. That's right. Yeah.
So we're working on 2 targets with them. We're working on Kaziba and we're working on Me Too. And then of course, drilling at Dumbwa with KoBold. KoBold's going to be steering the ship. We're going to get out there. They're going to drill aggressively. They're required to do 2,000 meters of drilling in year 1. It'll be up to them if they go further than that, but I don't think they're going to waste time. They have an aggressive approach. They have the right team and they know exactly what they're doing. And of course, now you have Kevin Bonnell. Kevin joins us.
Okay.
Becomes our COO on the basis of all of our plans, but Dumbwa in particular, and reuniting with David Brout. So now you have Kevin as our geological seat at the table, back working with his old colleague, David Broughton, 2 of the top stratabound copper geologists on the planet working on this asset, and everybody in belief that this is a very, very significant system that we're going to work on. So pretty cool when you start to think about all of that and how these players have come together. And we couldn't be happier to have Kevin. He's brilliant. He's a phenomenal geologist. And David Broughton he's amazing. So what a team to have working on this. And then on top of that, David's cherry-picked team of people that he's put together that he believes are the brightest minds in Zambia to attack this thing. So pretty exciting stuff.
Your energy is infectious with this, Adrian. I love chatting to you about it. And it's cool because I've known you for like a decade in this business. I understand why you're so excited about Midnight Sun.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, you know, when you look at this business, so I'm going into my 28th year in this business, which is crazy. I started when I was in high school. I've literally grown up in this industry and I've looked at assets on every continent of every different metal you could think of. I've had gold projects. I've worked on copper, nickel PGM. I mean, you name it. I've never seen a copper project like Midnight Sun has. I've never seen an asset with so many unique features and upside and opportunity. It's really outstanding. And it led to my joining the company a couple of years ago. I mean, it really blew my mind when I looked at this, that this asset was put together and held together for this long. And, since joining, looking at what has come together and our grand vision and how that's played out and what it's attracted. I mean, how can you not be excited, right? It's pretty cool.
I get it. I get it. Look,
awesome.
Thank you for coming on today and jamming with me, getting in front of my audience. I appreciate it. And we're going to have to do a follow-up a few months down the road when we've got some more answers to unanswered questions.
Absolutely. Well, we'll be there. We're going to finally have drill results. We're going to have all these things moving forward and KoBold's going to be working. I mean, there is going to be so much to talk about, so much to look forward to. The time's upon us now. We get to finally find out how big these things really are.